So we have quite a bit of information to cover tonight. As I mentioned, I'm really, really, really excited about this one tonight. I think this is going to be a great resource for everyone, for people who have raised birds for decades, people who are just hoping to get started. This is going to be a great way to get those questions that you have answered. So I'm going to hop right in so we don't run out of time tonight. And we're going to start with our pre-submitted questions. As I mentioned, as we go through, go ahead, throw your other questions in the chat. You can put them in just as you think of them. You don't have to wait till the very end. And we will go back up and make sure we cover all those questions. You're going to notice as we go through this, I talk with my hands a lot. So you can see my hands waving around through here. I can't help it. It's just the way I am. So we'll start with question number 1. This one comes from Renee. And she says, is it okay to give chickens a little scratch feed as a treat in the summer heat? And I'll take that one since that's a nutrition related question. So yes, you can give your birds some scratch in the summertime. Feed in general, including scratch grains, does produce heat as it is digested. Protein and fat actually, or protein and carbohydrates, I'm sorry, produce the same amount of heat per gram. Fat produces higher amounts of heat per gram. So scratch grains are something that you can give in the summertime. Your birds might not be as hungry, or they're probably going to be interested in scratch grains. So you want to keep it to a minimum, but they might not eat as much of them as they would in the wintertime. But as long as you keep it to less than about 10% of total feed intake, then you're good to go on those scratch grains. So it is something you can do, just keep it at less than 10% of total feed intake. And just something to point out for feed intake, an adult laying hen should eat somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 pound of feed per bird per day. So if you do the math, you can figure out that's really not a whole lot of scratch grains. So don't throw a bunch out there, just throw a little bit out there. Okay, question number 2 comes from Terry. Terry asks, what chicken food is soy-free? So Kalmbach does have a soy-free option. We have 2 soy-free products. We have a 17% soy-free layer feed, and we have a soy-free non-GMO scratch grain. So if you're looking for something that's soy-free, we do have those offerings, and we're going to talk a little bit more about soy when we get into the other questions here. But we do have those offerings if that's something that you're looking for. You can check out our website, and all of our offerings are there. Okay, so Sunshine has a question. I have a broody hen that just won't stop. What can I do to get her off the nest and healthier? I've tried several things, and she is a die-hard mama bird. So Sunshine, I'm right there with you. I got a die-hard mama bird too. Mine happens to be a Colombian Wyandotte, and she is just the best broody mama there was. She goes broody as soon as the spring starts. She hatches chicks all summer long. It's hard to get her not to be broody, and she's actually quite mean. So if I try to move her or make her uncomfortable, she's actually pretty mean to me. She'll peck me pretty good. So there are a couple things to consider if you have a hen that you do not want to be broody. The first thing is, are those eggs fertilized? Was she with a rooster? Because if they are fertilized and there's a possibility that she could hatch out those eggs, one of the things you want to consider is, do you just let her do it? So when my hen, this particular one that's very broody, when she goes broody, I know it's going to be very difficult for me to make her uncomfortable enough that she's not going to be broody. Plus, she's going to be pretty mean to me in the process. So I just let her hatch out her chicks. I do. But if those eggs are not fertilized, then you've got a problem, because they're going to sit on that nest and it's not going to be fruitful. And then when those eggs don't hatch and you finally get to the point where you can take them away, many times she'll go broody immediately again. And what happens when they go broody is they stop eating their feed. They don't eat a whole lot. They drink just a little bit. And so very quickly they can become very unhealthy because they're not eating and they're not drinking the way that they should be. So one of the things you can do for a bird that has a strong tendency to go broody is you can try to separate them from the rest of the flock, put her in a cage that does not have a solid bottom, so she can't make a nice fluffy nest like a raised wire cage. If she sits on that, she's unlikely to feel very comfortable in actually making a nest and sitting on eggs during that. So that's one of the things you can do. You can try to make her get down, even though she's just going to hop up right back up there not too long after that. So those are just a couple of things you can try. One of the things, if you're absolutely positive that you do not want your hens to go broody, if you are interested in eggs and only eggs, look for breeds that do not have a tendency to go broody. And if you go to hatchery websites or you talk to breeders, many of them will know if their breed has a tendency to go broody, and choose ones that do not. Because if you're not interested in that, then you want to make sure you choose breeds that do not have a tendency to go broody. Allowing your birds to actually hatch their own chicks is a lot of fun. The biggest negative to that is that nature gives you 50-50 and you end up with too many roosters. So that's the biggest negative of it. But those are some things you can definitely try. Okay, the next question is from Diane. Diane says she's exploring how to get started with chickens. However, she has lots of predators in her area, and she needs a fenced-in area with top fencing around a small hen house. Her township limits them to 10 chickens and no roosters. There's a hatchery nearby that sells lots of different options, and she's just wondering, is 6 or 8 or the maximum allowed of 10 the best number to start with if you are a beginner? So that's going to depend on the size of the chicken coop that you buy. So chickens need about 1.5 square feet per bird inside space in the chicken coop. So if you already bought your coop, do your measurements and see how many birds you can actually fit in that coop. It might only be 6. If you buy one of those really small coops, it might only be 4. So just make sure you have enough space for those birds, about 1.5 square feet per bird. When I buy chicks, I think 6 or 8 is probably a pretty good number to start with. There's this thing called chicken math. If you don't have chickens, there's this thing called chicken math. And what happens is you say you're going to get 6 chickens, and the next year you have 10 chickens, and then the year after that you have 50 chickens, and it's exponential. It's just amazing how fast it happens. So don't be afraid to start small, because you can always add more to your flock. Specific breeds that you want to look for, I'm assuming that you probably want these chickens for egg production. So any of our dual purpose birds are really good options. I like really good standard breeds. I have Barred Rocks, Rhode Island Reds, New Hampshires. I love Wyandottes and Orpingtons. Those are all really good breed options that you can try. Okay. Next is Jennifer. Jennifer has a question about chick house reserve. Anybody out there, just go ahead and put your answer in the chat. Anybody out there currently using chick house reserve? I am. I'm currently using chick house reserve. So if you are, put some comments about what you love or what you don't love about it in the chat, because that is our newest product and I absolutely love it. So Jennifer's question is, chick house reserve suitable for Seramas? So, or do they need higher crude protein? So chick house reserve is meant for birds that are intended to become laying hens. It is a chick or a starter grower feed that is similar to our hen house reserve layer feed. So we formulated it with a similar concept, but the nutrients are tailored toward chicks intended to become laying hens. It's an 18% crude protein. So it is on the lower side of crude protein for what you will see for starter and grower feeds, but it's because we wanted it to be really for those chicks intended to be laying hens. Most of those are slower growing birds. They don't need packed with protein at the very beginning, like birds that you're growing for meat or intensive egg production. So it's a nice, gradual, good feed. You can use it for Seramas. Seramas are smaller birds, so a lot of people are usually, sometimes the bigger the bird, the more protein, but in some cases, like some of the bantams, the smaller the bird, the more protein. You can use this for Seramas. They may grow a little more slowly as the chicks progress, but other than that, it is very well rounded in its nutrition. I promise you, Dr. Higgins gets to come in here too. I'm not leaving her out on purpose. So the next question comes from Pam. She has 16 14-month-old hens, and they're laying between 11 and 14 eggs a day. Now, all of a sudden, they're getting 6 one day and the next 10. So that might happen just in the egg cycle. It takes about 24 hours for a complete egg cycle to happen. So if your birds just happen to be cycling around the same time, you might get fewer eggs one day, more eggs the next day. That can be completely normal. Happens in large commercial houses as well. No flock, even in intensely managed commercial houses, is 100% production, meaning that every bird lays an egg every single day. That's just unattainable. So it's perfectly normal for there to be some variation in how those birds lay. 14 months is a good age for those birds. They're still really young. I guess they'd be in their second summer now. So just make sure they have feed available to them at all times. And that can be a perfectly normal change in the cycle of those birds, or if there's a stressor that happens one day that might throw them off a little bit, that does happen. Okay. So the next question comes from Dawn, and I'm going to turn this one over to Dr. Higgins. Dawn asks, what's the best way to keep weight on your birds and keep them healthy through the hot Texas summers? So since she asked about healthy, I'm turning this one over to Dr. Higgins.
And Texas gets hot, my goodness. So it's a good question, and it's a good question for, well, honestly, people in multiple states. So good old-fashioned shade and cold water can be very helpful, and making sure that you've got both readily available to the birds. And then depending on how your coop is set up, when we get in the type of birds you have too, and there's a big difference between little chicks versus bigger broilers, or getting into turkeys, and in the size of them and how much heat they can withstand. So for some of those bigger birds, yeah, someone's raising them in the Midwest too. And Cornish broilers, there, another great example. You want to keep those cool when we get especially into temperatures above 100. Some fans in your coop can be helpful. Not everyone has that available. Putting ice cubes in your water is something that you can do to try and help. Dr. Jefferson, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that's perfect. So a lot of times in the summer, we feel like we have to do more for our birds. But as Dr. Higgins mentioned, shade and cold water is probably the most important thing you can do. So I will, for my birds in particular, I replace the water every day, make sure they get really good cold water in the mornings. If it's really, really hot outside, I might replace the water again in the afternoon. There are a couple people who asked about this in the questions. I only do cold water. I don't add anything else to the water. I don't do any supplementation as far as like electrolytes or adding anything to the water, just cold, fresh, good drinking water that's available for the birds all the time. And as long as they have a chance to acclimate, they can handle hot weather. They have shade, cold water, they should be good to go. Yeah.
And I would fully agree with that. Good cold water, nothing added. We don't need to add Gatorade or anything to it. I mean, just some nice cool water can do a lot. And looking through the chat here, we're getting some really fun comments too. It looks like we've got some chicks that are, or some chickens here that are living better than I do some summers, and some air conditioning. We have some neat setups out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the next question comes from Catherine. This is a two-part question, so I'll do the first part and then I'll let Dr. Higgins do the second. She asks about feeding different formulas throughout the year. Do you need to switch? Do you need to add corn? Do you need to switch for the molt? So one of the things about keeping chickens is you can make it simple if you want to. I don't switch any of my feeds out throughout the year. I feed the same thing all year long, and that's a 17% layer pellet. I prefer pellet. So I feed the 17% layer pellet, or I'll use some hen house reserve. But I don't switch out because my birds are all different ages. I have young hens that are still laying eggs through their first winter. And so I will keep all my birds on layer feed all the time because I want to keep getting those eggs from those young hens. My older birds, they molt in the winter. That's natural. They definitely do it. But I don't switch anything out. And you don't really need to make it complicated. So you can keep feeding the same thing. If it's really cold, maybe they'd like an extra treat or some whole corn or something on a really, really cold night. But that's not something that you have to do all the time. Now, if your birds are molting and their feathers just don't look like they're coming in very good, or they've had hard molts, or they're those really persistent broody hens, and broody hens who don't actually hatch out chicks, that can be a very, very stressful time for them. And if they're doing that right around the fall when they molt, they'll look terrible. So in those cases, yes, you could justify switching to something like full plume feathering feed. It's a higher protein feed to help those birds build those feathers back before winter comes. But you definitely don't have to change your feed out. So you can feed the same thing all through the years, as long as you have birds that are actively laying eggs. So the next part of this question is about respiratory issues. Are they always a true problem for chicks, i.e. a death sentence? And for those of us who hatch and sell chicks, what's a cost-effective way for testing? And what are best practices on a backyard business level for biosecurity practices on a backyard business level? So I'll go ahead and turn that one over to Dr. Higgins.
And there's a lot of great questions within those couple of sections there. And so to start with different types of respiratory diseases, there are many different types of respiratory diseases, with some being very severe and some having minimal clinical signs. And so to lump them all in one category is tough. And I would really recommend, if you're seeing puffy eyes, if you're seeing a lot of snot, head shaking, anything along those lines, to get it checked out, and to find a good vet that is used to working with poultry to try and help figure out what type of respiratory disease that could be. And I'm gonna post in the chat here. I've got I'm based out of Ohio, but I work in many different states, and so each state often has their own resources on ways to find veterinarians. Is there a website where you can find a poultry veterinarian? That's exactly what I was getting to. It looks like Deb was thinking the same thing there. And there are, but it does tend to be state specific in general. And now I'm going to post this first link here that just gives you some resources to look for with respiratory diseases, and how to help defend your flock. And then the second one I'm going to post is going to give how to get NPIP certified. And there should be a link associated with that gives the NPIP agency for each individual state. And if you were to contact the person for that agency, NPIP is the program, and then that program has an agency within each state, then they can help get you in touch with veterinarians in your state. Another option too, that marketing email that Rachel posted, if you send her an email and let us know which state you're in, then I can help find resources to get you in touch with some vets, because there are some wonderful poultry vets out there. It's just a matter of trying to find them, because sometimes they can be tough to find. And then the second part of that question talked about if you're hatching, selling chicks, and cost-effective ways for testing. And looking at her question here, she says local vets at cost can be $125 per bird for mycoplasma testing, and that's one sort of disease that can cause respiratory signs. There are options that are less expensive than that, and it's a matter of getting you in touch with the right veterinarians to look at some of those options. And so I would recommend, if you're hatching or selling chicks, the best way to prevent some of those major respiratory diseases is to join the NPIP program and become certified in it, because it has different aspects to the program where you can have your flock tested for some of those diseases that cause respiratory issues, or can be a concern for contaminated eggs, salmonella in eggs. You can have your birds tested to make sure they're not passing that to other birds or to eggs that people could be eating, especially if you have flocks that are over 300 birds. It becomes very cost effective, and it's a good measure to help provide good health to other people that are getting chicks from you. And so here, if you look here, I'm going to post this second link here, and it just gives some info on that National Poultry Improvement Program, which is the NPIP program that I mentioned a few minutes ago here, and what all that involves. Oh goodness, Nancy, we could do an entire webinar on that and the benefits to it, and what all that could involve in types of testing that you could, and trying to find a good vet in your state. There's many things that we could keep talking about with that, but if you're interested in it, I would recommend you take a look at the link, and it gives you a nice layout of what all is involved with it. And I'm thinking that I answered a lot of those questions. And then there was a question that she had about best practices for biosecurity. And part of that NPIP program incorporates biosecurity, and being a member and getting certified in the program. They have different biosecurity steps to help protect your flock, and what that would involve. And that would be things like having separate boots for your coop, so you're not bringing in potential dust or disease that could be on dirt on the bottom of shoes from an outside place, to help protect your flock from getting other diseases, and lots of different there's lots of different aspects to that biosecurity, and that NPIP program, in this link that describes that can help better explain that, because there are definitely things that can help with it. And then the last part she had there was, would love to hear favorite tips or tricks to poultry raising and health from Dr. Jefferson and Dr. Higgins. So I'm going to pass it back to you here in a minute. But just one of my favorite tips for people that are getting ready to get chicks. You can find breeders that have NPIP certified chicks, so you can be guaranteed that they're negative for some of these diseases that can cause respiratory disease or other disease later in life, and that can be transferred from the egg to the chick that then hatches. And so if you can get them without it to begin with, then that can help start you off to a better start. So I do recommend looking into those NPIP certified flocks, and then also looking into a vaccine for day-old chicks called Merrick's. Merrick's disease is what you're protecting against. The Merrick's vaccine is something that it's a virus that can be everywhere in the environment, and it depends on the luck of the draw on whether or not your chick will be affected by it when they're getting to the end of their pullet phase. And so if you vaccinate them early, then that can help prevent issues. Dr. Jefferson, what would you add to that for favorite tips?
Sure, those are great. So the only thing I'll add to that is, when you're looking at vaccination, it is way easier for us to have vaccination done at the hatchery or the breeder level, because most vaccines are going to be in 1,000 bird or 10,000 bird doses, which just aren't practical for us with backyard flocks. And so that's something you want to consider before those chicks even arrive to you. So don't think, well, I'll get them and I can vaccinate them later. You probably can, but it's not as practical or as easy to do right off the bat. So that's definitely something that you would want to consider from the hatchery or the breeder level.
And sometimes those vaccines are really finicky and have to be at a very specific temperature. And it's tough to do that if you don't get it done at the hatchery. You want to get it done beforehand.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to skip to a different question while you're on, Dr. Higgins. So we had a couple of people ask about avian influenza. Do you want to touch on that, what it is and how to help prevent it in backyard flocks?
Yes, yes. Let me, so avian influenza is a virus that birds can get that causes respiratory signs, respiratory disease, and so it goes along with the previous question. It's one of those really bad diseases that can cause respiratory signs, and I've got some great links to give to you all in the chat here to help further explain that too, and different signs to look for. Those puffy eyes under so underneath the chicken's eyes, whereas we have, you know, like when you have a sinus cold, you feel really congested, they get puffiness right underneath their eyes because that's where their sinus cavity is. And so that's one thing to look for. Discharge coming from their nostrils, head shaking, purple combs, or discolored feet, and then the major thing to look for with what's called high path avian influenza, high path AI, which is a specific type of avian influenza that causes severe death losses. Obviously, death is death, and it's something that's very, very contagious and can affect flocks, spread through the air. And so if you have any concern with your flock potentially having it, it's really important to reach out to your state diagnostic lab, or your state poultry association, or that last link that I gave, where you can find in that article your MPIP coordinator, to reach out to that person to let them know that that you're seeing these signs and you want to be able to have testing done for it. Because right now we're actually, it's not something that is considered endemic or normal to find in America, not normal to find in the US. It's been found in other countries, but the US is considered free of it. And this year we had an outbreak of it, and where we've lost, at this point, we've lost over 40 million birds that have died from it, or the flock has needed to be euthanized to help keep other birds from getting it, because it's a very deadly virus. And so very important, if you're seeing those signs, to look more into it. And let me post this link, because this is the worst outbreak for avian influenza that we've seen in the US in years. I mean, and as you heard me say, we've lost millions of birds from it. Very devastating, and it's a big deal, and it's worth making sure that you're aware of and understand. And I'm happy to take more questions relating to it too. I don't mean to keep going on and on about it, but I want to be able to answer any specific questions about it.
So just some simple things we can do as backyard poultry keepers to try to prevent avian influenza. It can be carried by migratory birds and wild birds. So it's not something where you have to be in a commercial poultry house to get it. This is something that can be carried by all of the birds that are around. So one of the things to keep in mind is, I know a lot of people love to do it, but if you have backyard chickens, don't have bird feeders. So a lot of folks who have backyard chickens also love to feed your birds, but what you're doing is inviting potential carriers onto your property. And so if you are concerned about avian influenza, and if you want to take steps to prevent it, one of the first things to do is take down those bird feeders. Another thing to do is make sure you don't visit other flocks and move back and forth. Or, for example, my husband and I have quite a few hay fields, and we have some that run right along water sources. So I'll see ducks or geese out there in our hay fields. I make sure I don't walk out there in those hay fields where there could be wild ducks or goose droppings, and then walk into where my chickens are in the same clothing or the same shoes. I don't want to be a potential carrier for that, going from one place to another. So those are just simple steps you can take to make sure you prevent avian influenza in your backyard flocks. Because as Dr. Higgins mentioned, it can be devastating to your flock, but it's also a really big deal to the commercial industry and your Department of Agriculture. If your flock is positive for avian influenza, then the Department of Agriculture will get involved. So you'll have people probably on your farm that you don't really want there. And so just take some steps to make sure you can help prevent that from happening.
And Dr. Jefferson, you brought up a really good point. The bird feeders and these wild birds, and especially wild waterfowl, they can be carrying the disease and be what we call asymptomatic, which means that they have no signs, but they can yet spread it to your birds in your backyard, at home, and then it could kill your birds. So don't have your coops near the water, not near ponds. And actually a lot of these cases of what the USDA calls backyard flocks, those cases were associated with wild birds and wild bird contact.
Another thing I do as a backyard poultry keeper is I keep all of my feed and all my water inside my coop. Because if I keep it out in the run, especially if you have chicken wire or a larger opening in the hole of your run, you'll see in the morning, if you leave feed or blocks or water out in your coop, you'll see little birds out there getting drinks and eating from your feeder. And so you want to avoid that. So I keep everything inside to make sure I'm not inviting rodents, which are also, we didn't get too many questions about that, but rodents, which are also big carriers for disease, or wild birds near my chickens.
That's a good point too.
Okay, so we'll go back to another nutrition related question. I'm going to answer the pre-submitted questions for about 10 more minutes, and then we'll switch over to the questions everybody put in the chat, because I don't want this to run on forever and ever. So Melissa asks about nutrition for aging flocks. So if you look at a feed tag between a starter and grower feed and a layer feed, the one thing that's probably going to stand out to you the most is the amount of calcium in that feed. Birds that are laying eggs need high amounts of calcium in order to produce eggshells. So once birds aren't laying eggs anymore, they don't need quite those high levels of calcium. And so if you have an aging flock that is still laying eggs, even if it's just sporadically, I would continue with a complete layer feed, because they need calcium to put on those eggshells. But if you've got some golden girls that are just not laying at all anymore, they're good and retired, or maybe you have some bachelor roosters or just some pets that aren't in production at all, we have a feed called our 16% Flock Maintainer. That's a really good feed because it still has a good nutrient balance, but it is less nutrient dense. So it gives the birds the nutrition that they need, but it doesn't overstuff them with nutrients that would be for a bird in production, one that's growing for meat production or one that's laying eggs. So once your birds stop laying eggs, or let's say you just have bachelor roosters, then that's a feed you could consider. A couple of you guys asked about feeding high calcium layer feeds to roosters and also to drakes, so male ducks. So I will talk and I will get briefly into some of the things to consider there. So there is a lot of buzz about high calcium feeds for birds that don't need it, that it can be damaging to their internal organs because they have to digest that excess calcium. And that is a possibility. That could cause problems. But it's something that would happen over time, and it's a could cause problems. So it may or it may not. So some people are not willing to take that chance. I myself actually layer feed to all of my birds, including my roosters. That's easier for me. I want one feed for everybody. I don't want to have to feed anybody separately. But if you're not comfortable with that, then you could use a really good maintenance feed or a really good starter grower feed and provide a supplemental calcium source for your hens. A lot of people like to do that. Another thing you can do is if you have two feeders, one of them has layer feed in it, the other one's up a little bit higher and it has a maintenance feed in it. Now this higher one is too high for the layers to get to, but the rooster, since he's taller and bigger, he can actually get up there and eat that. Now that's not going to prevent him from eating the layer feed, but at least it gives him an option. So that's something that people like to do. Another option is a food like Hen House Reserve. So the really awesome thing about Hen House Reserve is it has multiple independent sources of calcium. So the birds that need the extra calcium can eat it, and the birds who don't can choose to just let it be. And actually, a lot of people don't give credit where credit's due when it comes to chickens. I actually think chickens are really, really smart. They self-regulate very well. So in those particular cases, I do think that the roosters, and I haven't actually tested that out, like research wise, but I do think the roosters self-regulate themselves very well, choose to leave behind some of the independent calcium sources, while the laying hens that need it clean it up. So that is an option in those particular cases. Okay, so Deborah asks, she'd like to get more information on geese nutrition and turkey nutrition. I do know that waterfowl tend to need more niacin. I give my geese brewer's yeast as a supplement. Is that a good idea, or is there something better? And there were a couple other questions here that also asked about ducks and geese in particular. So there are some nutrient differences between ducks and geese and chickens. Niacin is by far the most recognized nutrient when it comes to waterfowl. At our nutrition help desk, we have a way people can email in questions to our website. They can call in to our office and they'll get someone in the nutrition help desk. We answer, does this feed have enough niacin for ducks? We answer that question at least 6 to a dozen times every week. We get it all the time. It's a really common question. Keep asking your questions. Keep asking if you don't know. I absolutely encourage questions. So that one's a really well-known nutrient. The reason why ducks and geese and waterfowl in particular need higher levels of niacin is because they're not really good at breaking down their other longer nutrients and getting niacin out of it. So they're not great at actually making their own niacin. So we have to supplement them with niacin. And they grow so fast and so quickly, they need a lot of energy to make that happen. So while a lot of people think about protein and they know protein really well, and most ducks and geese do need higher protein feeds. That is one of the big differences in nutrients for them. One other thing people forget about a lot and is really needed for ducks and geese is higher energy. So that's something to consider as well, because those birds are growing really, really fast. Brewer's yeast does have niacin, so it is a common supplement for people to use when they're feeding waterfowl. But if you buy a feed specifically formulated for ducks or geese, and all of the Kalmbach products, the Flock Maker, Flock Maintainer, and the 18% duck and goose are fortified with extra niacin. We make sure that there's enough niacin in those feeds. We even put it on the feed tag. So that will meet all the nutrient needs for those particular birds. Okay. So the next question is going to be from Rick. He asks to wash or not wash your eggs. This one is has always been a controversial question, depending on how you answer. So there are people who wash their eggs, there are people who don't and live by the do not do it rule. So there are a couple things to consider. The United States Department of Agriculture recommends that you wash your eggs. And all eggs that are in your grocery store have been washed and they are refrigerated at that point. So that's why most of our eggs are kept under refrigeration. It is up to you whether you want to wash your eggs or not. I personally do wash my eggs. Now I'll collect all of my eggs and they may sit on my counter for 4 or 5 days, even up to a week or so before I get around to it. But then I'll wash them because I just don't like seeing the manure and the feathers and most of the time your eggs are going to be clean, but you're still going to get little bits of things. So I do wash them and then I put them in the fridge. If you wash them, you must refrigerate them. If you choose not to wash them, you can leave them out on the counter for a week or maybe 2 weeks, maybe even a little longer than that. So the reason for that is because right before that egg is laid, there is it's called the bloom. There is a thin layer of like a membrane that the hen puts on top of that egg. And the reason she does that is because if we think about egg production for what it really is, which is reproduction, that egg is supposed to be incubated for 21 days. That's a pretty long time, right? So that embryo inside that egg needs to be protected from bacteria and all that stuff from getting inside the egg, because the bacteria gets in, the embryo is not going to live. So that's the hen's natural way to protect her embryo. She puts this layer called the bloom on the egg. It protects the egg from bacteria coming in and out. So that's the reason why you can leave them out on the counter. It's completely up to you whether you want to do it or not. But if you do wash them, you need to refrigerate them because you're removing that protective layer and you're opening up the pores of that egg for bacteria to come in and out, come in particular, and you want to make sure that you avoid that. Okay. So the next question is from Morgan. She says, can a vitamin D deficiency or calcium deficiency cause fluid buildup in the abdomen of hens? Okay, so this is kind of health related, but I'm going to touch on it first because it's about nutrients, vitamin D and calcium. So I think there are a few things to consider in this particular case. Vitamin D and calcium do go hand in hand. So birds need a lot of calcium in order to make eggshells, right? And vitamin D helps calcium be absorbed. So in order for calcium to actually get into, be absorbed in the digestive tract, get into the bloodstream, get deposited where it needs to be, there has to be vitamin D there to help it. If we think about that from a real practical standpoint, I mean, you guys know full fat milk has vitamin D added to it, right? And one of the main why would you add vitamin D to milk? Well, one of the main nutrients in milk is calcium. So that vitamin D helps that calcium become available to us. Because if we don't have enough vitamin D, it doesn't matter how much calcium we take, it's not going to be absorbed. So vitamin D and calcium go hand in hand. They're really important for each other. So one of the things to consider about hens that have problems, and I'll let Dr. Higgins kind of touch on this here in just a second, but it's really important to consider how that egg is formed in the reproductive tract. Because a lot of times we think of eggshells as like a protective barrier. This eggshell should protect that egg from anything from happening to that egg as it passes through the hen. But that's not how the hen is, or how the egg is actually produced. The eggshell is actually the last thing that hen puts on the egg. So if we think about how that egg is made inside the reproductive tract, she has the follicle, the egg yolk, and she ovulates, she releases that follicle. And when we start out with an egg, that's all we have is the egg yolk. It's pretty amazing. I mean, chickens just fascinate me. I just love it. They fascinate me. But that's all we have when she first starts is this follicle. And then she starts to add membranes and thick and thin albumin and more membranes. And then it isn't until the very end that the eggshell gets put on. So a lot of times I think if there's a problem in the reproductive tract, the first thing people think about is, well, why didn't the eggshell protect it? But that problem may have happened before there was even an eggshell on that egg, because that's the last thing that happens to her. So I'm going to let Dr. Higgins talk a little bit about any things that might cause fluid buildup in the abdomen, but it's really difficult to know exactly where on that reproductive tract something may have happened, because it might have even been before that high calcium, that eggshell, that calcium suck to make those eggshells even occurs. So I'll turn it over to you. Sorry, I hope that made sense.
That was really helpful, and it gives a good explanation, because the very straightforward answers. I was looking at this question, and we want to make sure. Oh yeah, Morgan, I'm looking at your answer there, and you said it went back down after you gave calcium gluconate, and then came back after being off of it. The short answer is that you really need to work with a local vet to help work this up. That's the most helpful thing I can tell you, because there are many different causes for that. And the calcium gluconate and shell probably do not relate directly to that fluid buildup in the abdomen. There's different types of fluid that can happen in the abdomen, and that can relate to so many different things. And I hate to give you a bunch of different answers, because I can't tell you that it's even one of these, because there's so many different options. And it takes an additional workup, looking at what type of fluid it is, what other things are going on with that chicken's body, to be able to say what that cause is. But but calcium gluconate is something that can help with something called layer fatigue. If if she doesn't have enough calcium to cause contractions in the uterus or the shell gland in order to push eggs out, and but the fluid may not be related to that. She could be deficient in calcium because of something else related to not eating or being sick, causing that fluid buildup. Things like liver failure, heart failure, different viruses, different cancers can cause it. I will say, to be very straightforward, and I hope this is helpful, when a chicken gets fluid buildup in the abdomen, it's normally not it's not something that goes away. It does tend to come back again and again, and that's where you need to work with a veterinarian to decide where's the quality of life for her, and when is she eating, doing well at home, and that's a choice that you have to make to understand, where her quality of life is compared to when would it be more considerate to consider something like euthanasia. And Morgan, that's and you're saying she's a bit older, but otherwise doing good. I do hope that's helpful. And it sounds like you care very much, because you even took her to a veterinarian already, and I hope it works out well. But I am concerned that that there's something more serious going on with her, and it's going to take more of a workup to understand that one for sure.
Okay, I'm going to hit, since it's already almost 7 o'clock, so I'm going to hit a lot of the health related questions. We'll take 2 more of those, and then we'll go up and we'll do the chat. So the first one is from Jennifer. She has a leghorn that has a prolapse. She has isolated her, soaked her in Epsom salts, tried preparation H, witch hazel, tried to push the prolapse back in. So how do people deal with a prolapse?
And this is another one where I wish I had more positive, easy answers where I could say, here's this, magic fix that's going to fix this very quickly and easy for you. But unfortunately, what we would consider chronic cases of prolapse, which would be what I'm assuming is going on here, where it's gone on for an extended period of time, meaning more than just a day, that it often is not easy to resolve, and euthanasia is something that may need to be considered. But let's talk a little bit more about it, because it's first and foremost very, very critical to separate her from other birds in the flock, because as many of you already know, birds, poultry are very curious. And so if the other birds are seeing her prolapsed cloaca is what it's called, unless it's getting much, much bigger, then it might be her uterus too, or shell gland. But if other birds are seeing that, then they're curious and they want to peck at it, and that can cause tissue tearing. It can cause infection, and really hurt her. Now, the underlying cause of the prolapse needs to be determined to try and understand if you can fix it. It could be from many different causes, whether that be calcium deficiency. One of the most common causes would be what we call prolonged egg laying, which would be where they're laying eggs consistently every day for a really long period of time. So don't have a break, don't have a molt, and they do it for a year, 2 years, long period of time without any sort of break on that uterus, on that shell gland, and the muscles get tired, and or having a lighting schedule that's not normal, or really long extended periods of light, that can increase the bird's frequency of egg laying or size, and that can affect it too. And things like internal parasites can cause it. But this is where we would want to find you a good vet that's used to working with poultry near you, to try and help figure out what could be that actual cause of the prolapse. And then there are some really extensive things you can do. First, figure out that underlying cause, what caused it to begin with, because otherwise you could fix it. And if we don't fix that underlying cause, then it's just going to come back. But there are actually poultry surgeons that can do something called a ventplasty. And that's where they take that excess tissue that's part of the prolapse and they surgically remove it. But that bird that would get that, they can no longer lay eggs anymore. We'd have to be able to prevent her from laying eggs in the future through some hormonal adjustments. And so it's really extensive, and that is a big deal. And I don't typically recommend that. There's many risks involved with it. And there honestly are not many veterinarians that can do that and are used to doing it or are willing to do it. So that comes back to the first statement that I had, which is if it's chronic and she's not doing well, then euthanasia is something that you should really consider. If she's doing well, laying eggs otherwise, and it just prolapses and you can keep her away from other birds that could peck at it and you can keep it clean, then that's a whole nother story where that's up to you to decide where her quality of life is and how she's doing. Dr. Jefferson, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's great. Yep, I think that's great. The last question to touch on before we move over to what is in the chat, can you talk about crop issues, sauerkraut, if people see large crops, watery crop, some of those common problems in backyard flocks?
So sauerkraut technically is a yeast infection that's caused by a type of yeast called Candida albicans. And some of you may be familiar with that because if you've had babies, that's the same thing that causes thrush in babies. It's the same type of yeast. And it gets into the crop and it leads to thickening of the crop wall, dilation of the crop, and birds lose condition and can possibly even die if it gets severe. And so sauerkraut is caused by disruption of that normal bacterial flora that inhabit the crop. And then this overgrowth of this yeast called Candida or candidiasis is the term that's used to describe that condition. It grows too much and then causes this imbalance. And I want to really focus in on the importance of preventing that, to keep a good normal bacterial flora, a good habitat, a good environment in that crop. Use clean water that Dr. Jefferson mentioned earlier. She changes her water every day. That is one of the most critical things you can do for your birds, is provide clean water that's changed daily to prevent bacteria and yeast from getting into that crop. And then there's some other things that can disrupt the crop too. I've heard of some very unique feeding programs that have led to sauerkraut unintentionally. And so I really recommend sticking to a good, well-balanced diet rather than trying to experiment with different things, because there may be unintentional consequences from doing that. And then sauerkraut could be that secondary issue. And then if you're dealing with sauerkraut, I would really recommend you reach out to a veterinarian, because there are some antifungal things, antifungal medications that they can potentially give. There's and then on top of that, if that crop gets really big and large, dilated, it may need to be expressed, because chickens can't vomit. Fun fact for the day, chickens can't vomit, and so you may need to a veterinarian to help get that out of there, and you want to be careful to make sure they don't accidentally re-aspirate that into their lungs. And so it's not something that I recommend dealing with routinely on your own. But Dr. Jefferson, anything else you would add to that too?
No, but along your line of chickens not vomiting, another cool fact about chickens, if you ever watch them drink, they actually have to drink. They don't swallow either. So they drink from using gravity. So they dip their beaks in and then they have to tip their necks up and the gravity helps it drain. So they don't have the muscles to push and pull things in and out of their throats. So that's another cool poultry fact there. We're full of them. Put us on Jeopardy.
We're equipping them with all kinds of fun things.
Yeah. Okay, so I am going to go to the questions in the chat because I think we're ready to move on to that part. So Jill asks, I have a problem with feather loss. I started with one hen and now it seems to be spreading to others. The feathers are on their lower back. Any idea what could be happening? So the first thing that came to my mind is that's from the rooster. So if you have a rooster, I don't know if you do or not, but if you have a rooster, when he jumps on the backs of those hens, they'll often lose their feathers on their back. We call it their saddle. And so that's why they even make little saddle pads you can put on your chickens so that the rooster doesn't damage the back of their feathers. But another thing you want to look at anytime you see feather loss is for the sign of parasites. So I'll let Dr. Higgins talk about the different types of mites or parasites that might be there and what to do if you have them.
So there's multiple different types of parasites, and this is a great opportunity for me to pull this up and show some of you. Dr. Jefferson and I, a couple of years ago, did a webinar specifically about different types of diseases that you could see in chickens and different things you could do to try and help keep your birds healthy. And can you see this picture here?
Yes.
Okay, so here's one type of mite that you can get. It's called the northern fowl mite, and they're these little black looking dots. They can look red, and it's typically around the vent area, around feather follicles, and you want to look really closely. So you want to look really closely right around those feathers that are near the vent for these blackened areas. And here's some good options to treat it. So permethrins are a really good option to try and treat it. You do need to make sure that you're not overdoing it, and you've got to be careful around the eyes, but you want to coat the entire bird, rub the dust all over the bird's skin, especially focusing on that vent area, and then repeat it every 7 days for at least 2 additional times. So 7 days and then 14 days. And then I like to go to 21 days. And that's to help with the life cycle of that mite, because there's not good options for the eggs to kill them. So you have to wait for it to hatch and become an adult. And so that's why you have to do these repeat treatments to make sure you're catching them right as they're getting to the point of being an adult. So that way they're not going to stick around. There's a permethrin concentrate, and then this Elector PSP. It's a little bit, it's more expensive, but it comes in a spray bottle, and this is something you can even spray in the nest boxes and the coops, and coarse spray all over the birds. Very safe to use, and you only have to do that every 14 days until the mites are gone, and typically that's at least 2 treatments to be safe. And then there's some other types of parasites here, chicken lice, which are similar to mites, but different category of bugs. And you'll see here very similar treatment. I really like that Elector PSP if you're dealing with this issue. And scaly leg mites, those are ones that burrow deep into the skin. They're not as common. If anyone's seeing an issue with that, then send us an email and I can send you more info on that, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about that one. There's the red mite. Most of their life cycle is off the bird, and they feed on the bird at night. And so you may not actually find these on the bird during the day, but you may find them in cracks or joints in the roost or nest during the day, and you may find the birds seem very irritated, have little red bite marks on them. It may affect their laying, and that Elector PSP would be my favorite option for that. But you can do these other treatments, and you want to make sure you're treating the entire house environment, especially for these ones. But is that answering the question about
Yep.
mites?
Yep, that's good. Yeah, and I'll just reiterate what Dr. Higgins said. If you think you have a problem with mites or lice, you need to treat your birds, but you also need to make sure you treat your coop and your house as well.
Yes.
So it's really important to make sure you do both, not just one or the other. Make sure you do both to really make an effective change for those birds. Okay, so moving on, we had someone ask if they can use oregano for their birds. So I'm going to touch on a couple of different things. We had a couple of different questions related to similar things. Let me get back up here to it. And that was Deb. So oregano oil or the plain dried herbs. You can use those for your birds. You want to be really careful with the oils, especially if they're like an essential oil, because they are extremely concentrated. And so a little bit goes a long way. In fact, our entire line of poultry feeds actually have essential oils already added to them. All of them, but just a handful on our poultry line. So most of the products in our poultry line, if it has Lifeguard, one of the components of Lifeguard is an essential oil component. So there are some very good health benefits to that. A lot of preventative benefits. If you have some kind of outbreak or a disease that you know about, you probably want to do a treatment, but those are things that you can use for prevention. So feeding the herbs won't hurt unless you feed something that's at a really high level or that could affect the taste of your egg on the backside. But the efficacy of it, you're probably not going to be able to feed enough to really make a huge difference. But as far as the oils are concerned, those are things you can use. There are a lot of products on the market specifically formulated for chickens. Those would probably be the best way to go, because those are probably using products that were designed, regulated, and tested for use in chickens. And so they're sure that they're safe and effective. So that might be the thing to consider there. Someone else asked about keeping flies away and using diatomaceous earth. So there are a lot of things you can do to keep flies away from your coop. Of course, they make the actual traps that trap flies. My husband and I also raise beef cattle, so we have a lot of flies. I've had success with those. I've had success with fly tapes before. I also do actually use a little bit of diatomaceous earth in the summertime if I feel like I'm getting too many bugs. And that can help keep some of the bugs down a little bit in the coop and some of the smell down, especially out in a run where it stays moist in the springtime. It can help dry it out a little bit. And anytime it's dry, you're going to keep bugs away. So really, there's a lot you can do as far as management to help keep bugs away. Keep it as dry as possible, because flies like moist, wet environments. And if you've got let's say your run's kind of muddy and maybe you can't keep it dried out very well, if there's things you can do, maybe some hydrated lime to dry it out a little bit, those keeping it nice and dry can help keep some of those bugs away. Okay, next question is, what can I do to prevent egg eating? Ooh, so that one's a tough one. So that is usually never nutrition related. That's usually personality related. And it's a hard habit to break. So if you have hens that are cannibalizing their own eggs or other eggs, let's say they're jumping up onto the nesting box and just picking on random eggs, usually you can determine which hen is your offender. If you can separate her, that's always an option. Another thing you want to try to do is make sure you collect your eggs as often as you can. So I like to collect mine. I really have good advantages because I can collect mine in the morning and I can collect them in the evening. It works out really well with my schedule. I can even go at lunch if I want to collect my eggs sometimes. So if you can collect them as often as possible, prevent them from being broken, not give them the opportunity to peck on them, that goes a long way. But once hens start doing that, it's a hard habit to break. So you want to try to separate that bird out, make sure she's not opening up eggs for other birds to get curious about, and see if you can prevent it that way. Okay, next question is from Tammy, and she wants to know, what's the best type of food to feed meat chickens so they grow well but stay healthy while developing a good size? Okay, so meat birds need higher protein than most of our pullet feeds. So our meat birds are usually going to need somewhere around 22% crude protein, it's because they're putting on massive amounts of body mass. They're putting on a lot of meat and a lot of protein. So they need a lot of that protein to build that muscle mass. They also need higher energy values. So they're usually higher energy values in those types of feeds. So look for a feed that's specifically formulated for broiler chickens or for meat birds. Kalmbach Feeds has a 22% start to finish meat bird feed. It's a perfect option for broiler chickens. And we also have it formulated, so it's a great fit for ducks and geese too. So that's a good one. Okay, Karen asks, why no supplements? I'm assuming this is in reference to the drinking water. I don't add supplements because my birds don't need it. So I could add it. They'll drink it just fine. They would get some extra vitamins and minerals, but they're getting all the vitamins and minerals they need from their feed, and they're free ranging. So there's not a detriment to adding it per se, other than they don't need it if they're getting a really well balanced, complete layer feed. Now, if they're not eating or there's something wrong, then that might be something you want to consider. But for healthy birds, cold, good drinking water is usually all they need to stay nice and healthy. Oh, lots of people asking about flies. Okay, try the traps. Try putting down, put down a thin layer of diatomaceous earth in your nesting boxes. Sometimes that will help. Make sure things are nice and dry. Okay. Okay, I'm glad Dr. Higgins answered the question about where to find a poultry vet. What's a good, comfortable brand of slip-on shoes to wear on a regular basis while you go out to your coop? Okay, so I have my barn Crocs and I have my dress Crocs, like I think we all have those. But I actually use my muck boots are probably my most common shoe that I wear. There are all kinds of different waterproof shoes. What you want is something that's nice and waterproof that you can spray off easily. That's really the most important type of shoe to get. Something you can clean, spray off easily, because anytime you're walking in and out of the coop, you're going to get stuff on your shoes.
And then Dr. Jefferson, if I could just add to that, I've got a link for one of my favorites here that I wanted to add there. It's a slip-on boot, and then just important to make sure it fully covers your shoes that you're wearing and otherwise. So it's tall enough that's going to fully cover those. Or in an ideal world, it'd be great if you just had different boots that you put on. Muck boots are really comfortable. Tingley is another brand that tends to be fairly inexpensive and waterproof. They have several different options that are really nice and very comfortable too.
Okay, so the next question is from Robin. She says, I have a 12-week-old pullet. Since day one, she has watery poop. She's tried vitamins and electrolytes, probiotics. Any reason why she would have watery poop? So I'll turn that one over to Dr. Higgins.
Let me see here. I was trying to follow that one. You said it was, she's asking about watery poop, right?
Yep, Robin at 7:04.
Yes, and the pullet's 12 weeks now, right?
Yes, but since day one, she's had watery poop.
So Robin, I got many questions for you, and so I would want to know what she's eating to make sure she's on a good quality diet, and Dr. Jefferson can talk more about that too. If you take a poop sample and take it to a vet clinic, then they can look for parasites, whether that be worms or coccidia. If it's since day one, that's not as likely. And but there are not many diseases that will cause watery poop from day one until 12 weeks of age without seeing it get a lot more severe, because it looks like, I was trying to see if she seems like she's getting really thin, if it seems like it's she's not feeling good, lethargic, just kind of dumpy. But I would recommend finding a vet clinic that'll test the poop for different parasites, and then make sure you've got her on a good quality diet for first stage of life. And Dr. Jefferson can talk more about that, because that's key to helping to set them up for success.
Yeah, so a really good starter grower feed that she has access to all the time, and good, fresh, clean drinking water.
Yeah.
So a thing to consider about a bird that just doesn't seem to digest well from the very start. And someone asked in the pre-submitted questions, they have a hen who lays an odd shaped egg, just one hen of their whole flock. And we have to consider that every once in a while, something in our either our digestive tract or in our reproductive tract seems to go wrong. And for that particular bird, they're just not a good digester, or they're just not a good reproducer. They're just not a good layer. And so that happens. So if it's something that's just one bird and it's not affecting your entire flock, it's probably related to her in particular. And it wouldn't be, I wouldn't focus too hard on disease if it's just one bird and, you know, the rest of your flock seems to be fine. So that's definitely something that could be happening. It's just, this bird just doesn't seem to digest feed well, has a sensitivity somewhere that we haven't been able to identify. But if she seems to be growing well, she seems to be performing well, she's on par with the rest of her flock mates, it might just be one of those birds that always seems to have a messy or a watery manure. Okay. Someone asked about their rooster having a crooked toe. Is that something they need to be concerned about? So I'm gonna turn this one over to Dr. Higgins and see if she agrees. But the first thing I'm gonna say is probably not. So there are breed standards where a bird has to have a certain conformation. A very common way that breeders actually get disqualified, where they become not good breeders, you don't want to pass those genes along, is a crooked toe. So that's probably what it is. It's actually pretty common. You'll see it a lot. But is there anything else, Dr. Higgins, that you think might be the reason for that?
I would want to know if the bird's walking well, if it seems like it's limping, to understand if it's something that seems painful or is hurting the bird, to better understand that one. And then the age, was the age given with that question?
Yeah, it was one of the pre-submitted questions, but I just wanted to bring it up.
If it's a little chick that's only a few weeks old or younger, then you can actually use cardboard to gently wrap it to the leg to try and correct it. In older birds, that doesn't work. It's got to be less than a couple weeks of age. But in general, it might just add a little bit of extra character, like you meant. And as long as the bird is eating, drinking, acting well, otherwise, I would say it's just some character.
Good. Okay, so a couple more questions. We had one person ask how they can train their chickens to lay in the box. And another person asked their chickens one of their birds will not go inside and roost inside at night. So how can they prevent these two things? So I'll start with your chickens that are not laying in the box. This says they're laying on the ground. So one of the things to consider is your nesting box in the proper place? So birds like a nice, dark, quiet place to lay their eggs. So if your nesting box is directly across from a window, they might choose not to lay in the nesting box because the corner on the floor of the coop is a quiet and darker place. So they might choose down there. So make sure your nesting box is in a quiet and dark place. Make sure the birds have plenty of nesting boxes for all the hens. You need one nesting box for every 4 hens. They won't use them all. They might even fight over only one of them, but that's still the recommended ratio. So you want to make sure there's plenty of room for everyone in there, and that you don't have 1 or 2 hens that are dominating the nesting boxes. So as soon as someone jumps in there, that dominant hen jumps in there and tries to push her out, and she doesn't feel comfortable enough using the nesting boxes. One thing you can try, put some fake eggs, or even some eggs that you don't mind if you don't actually get to collect them or harvest them. Put those eggs in the nesting box so they know that's where they're supposed to lay. And sometimes that will help. I find that if I raise a new flock of pullets and they are not around existing hens, they will lay on the floor quite a bit. But if I raise them around, or I let them around my adult hens a few weeks before my pullets actually start laying, they learn from the adult hens that you're supposed to jump up in the nesting boxes, and that's where you need to lay your eggs. So sometimes that helps too, if they can be around an experienced hen who does know and they see that happening. So the second question was, oh my goodness, I've already forgotten because I scrolled down. Nesting boxes, oh, going inside at night. Okay. So that's a hard one too, because birds typically, most birds will go inside their coop and roost at night. That's where they're comfortable. That's their home. So one of the things I would suggest to you is if she's roosting somewhere that's not inside the coop, pick her up and put her back in there. If she's up in a tree where you can't get to her, try to catch her at some point. And then I would keep her locked inside that coop for about a week or so. So she knows this is where she's supposed to be. She knows this is her coop. And then if you do let her out, hopefully then she'll realize, hey, this is a nice, safe place for me to go at night, and go back in there in the evenings. If she's being picked on by the other birds, then I wouldn't blame her for wanting to roost somewhere else. So that's another thing to consider to make sure that she's not being picked on by other birds. Okay. Let's see. Oh, looks like we're getting close to the end. All right, guys. So I think we're going to start wrapping up here in just a couple minutes. If you have any last questions, go ahead and throw them in there. I am going to give Dr. Higgins one or two more questions here. So now's the time to take our last minutes questions.
Yeah, if you have anything that we may have accidentally missed in the chat, or you're thinking that you'd really like to be answered, I mean, we want to be a resource for all of you. We want to help.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. So one of the questions that I get quite often, Dr. Higgins, is it's in relation to respiratory disease, or it's in relation to somebody seeing something that just doesn't seem quite right with their hens. I even experience it myself. Every once in a while, I'll see it. All the rest of my hens have nice, pretty clean, fluffy butts, and I'll have one that has obvious manure stuck to her feathers or some kind of discharge from her vent. Our very first instinct is to give them some antibiotics, right? So do you suggest that? And is there something that we should keep on hand in those particular situations?
I get asked that a lot, and what I hear as the underlying question with that is that people really care a lot, and I appreciate that, and they want to do what they can to help their chickens. And unfortunately, though, there are tons of different antibiotics out there, and there's many of them that we can't even use in what are called food animals, or animals that make food that we eat, and chickens are definitely part of that category. And so that can be illegal, and even more concerning than that, then that could be passed to eggs, and then that's something that we could eat unintentionally, and which is not good. And so we have to be careful about what we call withdrawal times. And so back in, I want to say 2017 was when it happened for the most part. It's no longer possible to get antibiotics. And I'm trying to think of if there's any exceptions even to that. It's not possible to get antibiotics unless you're getting it through a veterinarian, because veterinarians are trained on what is okay to use for that bird, and there's differences between poultry versus dogs versus cats versus horses versus pigs. There's lots of differences there, and we have to be able to know the dose, and we have to be able to know how that's going to affect the bird. So that's why I keep recommending trying to find a good veterinarian to work with, because I want each of you to be able to have an option if you have a sick bird. And so if we've got a good amount of people in here, but we want to help each one of you. If you send us an email, then we can help get you resources for poultry veterinarians in your area that you could keep in your back pocket to be able to work with if you do run into an issue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back up, and someone asked if I would address a 4-H question that we missed in the chat. So I scrolled back up and I found it. What's the best feed or supplement for show 4-H market broad-breasted turkeys to get that grand champion finished look and extra meat through the breast and keel bone? And what's the best way to wash them to get small stains out of the feathers? Did you show turkeys, Jess, or were you what did you show?
I saw that question, and I showed fancy chickens and I showed ducks and waterfowl, but I would think that this would work similarly. The best luck that I had was Dawn dish soap. And now if you use like the blue Dawn dish soap, the classic one, you have to make sure you rinse it really well to get rid of that blue color, but that also helps once you've rinsed it and you've done a good clean of the feathers. So I would think that that's probably one of the best things I've seen. Some people for white feathers, I've seen them try dog whitening shampoo. I still prefer the Dawn dish soap, and have seen it with my own experience, not with turkeys specifically, but I've seen good luck with it. And I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are with that one too.
Yeah, and for the feed portion, a really good high quality turkey feed, like a 28% start right turkey feed. You could feed that almost through the entire grow out. You might want to step down at 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how fast or how well your birds are growing. And then we have a product called Show and Glow. It's a supplement that you can use for turkeys. It's a high protein, high fat supplement, so it can help put on some of that finish that you're looking for. It's fed at about a tablespoon per bird per day. So it's a really great option for those show birds. But high quality turkey feed, high protein feed to those birds right from the beginning. And then as Jess mentioned, Dr. Higgins, one of the best ways to keep those birds' feathers nice and clean, keep their coop, and of course, wherever you're raising them, really dry. And then a nice bath will help a lot. Okay. Okay, and this will be our, we'll take one more question after this one. Dr. Higgins, what item would you recommend to keep in a chicken first aid kit?
If you're raising little chicks from the time you hatch them, something that I think is helpful to have on hand is something to help with splay leg, because occasionally you'll see these chicks that either slip on the floor and their legs just spread out, and because they don't have a lot of muscles to begin with, and so they can get something called splay leg, where they just splay straight out, or they could have a reason when they were hatching that could have caused them to have that from the time they hatched. And there's some really neat little devices that you can get on Amazon. That's basically it's like a woman's hair tie. Those a little hair tie with a little divider in between that you can use to wrap around either leg, that are create these little hobbles. And so if you look up chick hobbles, you can get a whole pack of them for like $9.99. But it takes the places that are options to get it takes like a week to get them. So I would recommend it before you get chicks, in case you do get that chick that has it. There's other options to make those hobbles too. Vet wrap is something that's great to have on hand, because you can make those little hobbles out of that. Or if you have something like bumblefoot that you're cleaning and then you're putting some gauze on, you can use that vet wrap to wrap around it to keep it clean. I'd say those are probably two really good ones to have on hand.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the last question of the night is going to be related to feather growth in ducks and other silkies. What can cause a chicken's feathers not to grow correctly? So I'll answer that with ducks first. There's a issue with ducks sometimes called angel wing, which causes the feathers to like stick out instead of lay nice and gracefully against their sides. And that can be caused by a protein imbalance. So you're probably feeding too little, or actually too much protein for as fast as those ducks are growing. So their feathers are growing faster than their body can handle, and they actually get almost too heavy for their wings to hold up. And you can fix that a lot of times by just vet wrap would be a great thing to use. You would just wrap it around the bird to hold the wing to their side until it gets strong enough that they can actually hold the wing in. It is only cosmetic, so it doesn't hurt. It's not painful for the birds. It doesn't affect them in any way. It is only cosmetic. But that's something that happens. For chickens, if feathers aren't growing in correctly, one of the things we consider, are they getting pecked on? Is there a rooster that is overbreeding your hens? And there are some things you can buy to protect those birds in those particular cases. By the way, the proper hen to rooster ratio is 1 rooster for every 10 hens. So if you have too many roosters, they're going to overbreed your hens and you probably will run into some feather problems. If you have hens that might be pecking on the birds or anything along those lines, those can all cause issues with feather growth, along with the parasites that Dr. Higgins already covered. So those are just a few things to consider. Really important about backyard poultry. So as I mentioned, I also have my own birds. One of the things you want to make sure you're doing is to keep your birds healthy, productive, active, just a really nice looking, beautiful flock. You want to make sure those birds have access to a really good quality feed that's specifically formulated for that type of bird in whatever production situation they're in. So if they're layers, if they're babies, if they're meat birds, and there are options out there for everyone. I'm happy to make suggestions for that. But a really good quality feed and good management as far as keeping things nice and dry, practicing good biosecurity, all of those things are the best way to make sure your birds stay healthy and active. Yeah. And as Dr. Higgins mentioned, we're here to help. We would love to help. If you have any questions or any issues, please feel free to reach out to us. Sounds like we could have done this. I mean, we're already at 7:40. We could have done this webinar in 2 or 3 or 4 different sectors. So we really appreciate everyone submitting your questions, putting your questions in the chat. And we are so blessed that everyone joined us tonight, and we're really happy to have you guys. So with that, I just want to say big thank you to Dr. Higgins. Another big thank you to Rachel Postello. Hi, Rachel. Is she still on there? Rachel's still up there. She organized this whole thing for us, did all of the social media for you guys. So Rachel's the face behind all of our posts, our articles, all of that stuff. She makes all that good stuff happen. So thank you guys so very much. If there's anything else you need, just let us know. And with that, we'll probably wrap it up for the night.